Have you ever walked away from a conversation with your teenager and thought, how did we end up arguing again? Maybe it started with something as simple as, how was school today? Fine. What did you do? Nothing. You've been in your room all day. Is everything okay? I'm fine. You don't seem fine. I said I'm fine. And just like that, the conversation is over. Someone gets frustrated. Someone feels misunderstood. A door closes. And you're left standing there thinking, I wasn't trying to start an argument. I was just trying to talk to my child. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know that you're not alone. This is one of the most common struggles I hear from parents. They tell me, every conversation turns into an argument. I feel like I have to walk on eggshells. I don't even know how to talk to my teenager anymore. And if you've ever felt that way, today's conversation is for you. Because what I'm about to say might completely change the way you look at those moments. The argument probably isn't the real problem. It's simply the moment you finally noticed there was one. I'm Keisha Golder. I help parents build emotionally intelligent relationships with their teenagers so they can create lifelong connections rooted in trust, emotional safety, and open communication. As a mom of two boys, I know what it's like to want nothing more than to stay connected to your child while feeling like every conversation is getting harder. After years of studying emotional intelligence, adolescent development, and coaching parents through these exact moments, I've learned something that changed the way that I communicate with teenagers. The healthiest conversations don't begin with the right words, they begin with a different mindset. This is the very first episode of our new series, Why Every Conversation with Your Teen Turns into an Argument. Throughout this season, we're going to uncover what really happens beneath those conversations that seem to fall apart so quickly. But before we learn better communication techniques, before we talk about conflict, before we talk about rebuilding trust, there's one transition that every parent has to make first. In the emotionally intelligent teen method, we call it teen talk transition. Because stronger conversations don't start when your teenager changes, they start when the conversation changes. And the conversation changes when we stop asking, how do I get my teen to listen to me? And start asking, what is my teen trying to communicate that I haven't understood yet? That one shift changes everything. It's the foundation of every relationship that we'll build through this entire road. One of the biggest mistakes that parents make isn't saying the wrong thing. It's assuming they're having the same conversation their teenager is having. Let me explain. When you ask, how was your day? You may be thinking, I'm checking in because I care. But depending on what happened at school, depending on how overwhelmed your teenager feels, depending on whether they already think you're going to lecture them, they might hear something completely different. They might hear, I'm about to be questioned. I have to explain myself. If I tell the truth, I'm going to get another lecture. Same conversation, two completely different experiences. And that's where arguments begin. Not with raised voices, not with disrespect, but two people experiencing the same conversation in completely different ways. And just to put this out there, the same thing happens with adults as well. I want you to remember this every time a conversation starts going sideways. Arguments don't begin with raised voices. They begin the moment two people stop feeling understood. When that happens, both people start talking, but neither person feels heard. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a conversation with your teenager where halfway through you realized you weren't even talking about the original topic anymore? Maybe it started because they forgot to take out the trash, or because they came home past curfew, or because they rolled their eyes when you asked the question. But somehow, 10 minutes later, you're hearing things like, you never trust me. You don't understand. You always think I'm doing something wrong. And you're thinking, wait a minute. We were talking about the trash. No, you weren't. The trash was simply the doorway. The real conversation had been happening underneath the surface the entire time. That's why I always tell parents behavior starts the conversation, emotions determine where it goes. Most arguments aren't really about chores or curfews or grades. Those things simply expose what's already happening in the relationship. The real conversation is often something much deeper. Do you trust me? Do you believe me? Am I safe enough to tell you the truth? Will you try to understand me before you judge me? Teenagers don't always know how to ask those questions out loud, so they ask them through behavior. I remember one afternoon where one of my boys came home unusually quiet. Normally, I'd get one of those random, "Ma, guess what happened today" stories before he even put his book bag down. But that day, nothing. Just a quick hey, straight to his room. Now, I had a choice, right? I could have followed him upstairs with 20 questions. What's wrong? What happened? Did something happen at school? Talk to me. And if I'm honest, there was a time in my parenting when that's exactly what I would have done. Not because I wanted to control him, but because I cared. Because I was worried. Because I wanted to fix whatever was wrong. But I learned that our good intentions don't always create safe conversations. So instead, I simply said, "Hey, I noticed you seemed a little quieter than usual today. I'm here if you want to talk later." And then I let it breathe. No lecture, no interrogation, no guilt, no pressure. About an hour later, he came downstairs, grabbed something to eat, and sat at the kitchen table and started talking. Not because I figured out the perfect thing to say, but because I created enough space for him to decide when he was ready. That moment taught me something that I'll never forget. Sometimes the quickest way to end a conversation is to push for it before someone feels ready. I wonder how many conversations we've unintentionally cut short because we're trying so hard to keep them going. Think about that for a second. How often have we mistaken urgency for connection? As parents, it's understandable. We want answers. We want reassurance. We want to know that our children are okay. But our teenagers often need something different first. They need to know they're emotionally safe, not emotionally cornered. There's a difference. One invites conversation, the other one invites defense. I want to give you something to carry with you this week. Connection grows in spaces where pressure disappears. Let that sink in, because when teenagers feel pressured, they protect themselves. When they feel emotionally safe, they begin to open themselves. That's not manipulation, that's human nature. And it's true for us as adults too. If someone came at you with 10 questions the moment you walked through the door after a hard day, you probably shut down a little yourself, right? Before we assume our teenager is being difficult, let's remember they're often responding to the emotional atmosphere of the conversation, not just the words that we're using. So, if arguments aren't about the thing we're arguing about, and if our teenagers are communicating something deeper beneath the words, how do we actually begin hearing what they're trying to tell us? That's where step one, teen talk transition, really begins. Because the first shift isn't changing your teenager, it's changing the way you enter the conversation. And once you make that shift, your teenager often responds differently without even asking them to. So, what exactly is teen talk transition? It's the moment you stop asking, "How do I get my teenager to understand me?" and start asking, "What does my teenager need from me in the moment?" Now, I know some of you might be thinking, but Keisha, what if they're wrong? What if they were disrespectful? What if they broke the rules? Those are fair questions. Those are fair questions. And we're going to talk about accountability throughout this series. But here's what I don't want you to miss. Understanding your teenager is not the same as agreeing with them. These are two completely different things. You can understand why they reacted the way they did without excusing their behavior. You can validate their emotion without validating the choice. That's emotional intelligence. That's relationship building. And that's the transition we're making today. Because when teenagers feel understood, they're much more willing to understand you. One of the biggest gifts we can give our teenagers is the willingness to step out of our own perspective long enough to consider theirs. As adults, we have years of experience, some good and some bad. We've survived heartbreaks. We've made mistakes. We've learned lessons. So, when our teenager gets upset over something that seems so small to us, our instinct is often to minimize it. We say things like, oh, it's not that serious. You'll get over it. Just ignore them. There are bigger things to worry about. We're trying to help, but what our teenager often hears is, your feelings don't make sense. Imagine if you came home from work after one of the hardest days you've had in months. Your boss embarrassed you in front of your coworkers, a project you've spent weeks on fell apart, and you walk through the door hoping someone will simply listen. Instead, the first thing you hear, well, at least you still have a job. Would that make you feel better? Probably not, right? It's not because the statement is false, but because it skipped over your experience. Teenagers need us to acknowledge their experience before we offer our perspective. That's how trust grows. Let me show you what that can look like. Imagine your teenager walks in frustrated and says, I hate my teacher. She always picks on me. One instinct might be to respond with, I'm sure she doesn't always pick on you, or you probably need to change your attitude. Again, we're trying to help, right? But before we even understood what happened, we've already corrected it. Now, imagine responding like this. That sounds like today was really frustrating. Tell me what happened. That's it. There's no lecture, there's no solution, no interruption, just curiosity. Do you hear the difference? One response closes the conversation, the other opens it. And here's what's interesting: when people feel heard, they often become more open to feedback, not because you convince them, because they no longer feel like they have to defend themselves. I wonder how many conversations with our teenagers become arguments because we move into problem solving before we finish understanding. Think about your last disagreement. At what point did you stop trying to understand and start trying to fix? There's no shame in that question. I had to ask myself the same thing because as parents, fixing comes naturally, but connection requires intention. Sometimes our teenagers don't need immediate answers. Sometimes they simply need to know my parent is trying to understand me before trying to change me. That one shift can completely change the tone of a conversation. Here's another truth that I want you to carry with you. The fastest way to lose conversation is to make someone feel like they have to defend their feelings. The moment someone feels like they have to defend what they're experiencing, they're no longer listening. They're protecting. And protection sounds a lot like an argument. It sounds like shutting down. It sounds like sarcasm. It sounds like eye rolls. It sounds like whatever. But underneath of all of that is often a teenager who's wondering, is it safe for me to be honest here? When we, as parents, understand that, we stop seeing our teenager as a problem and we start seeing the argument as an invitation to be more curious. So here's the one thing that I'd love for you to practice this week. The next time your teenager says something that immediately makes you want to correct them, pause, take one breath, and ask yourself one question. What might they be trying to communicate underneath these words? Not how do I win this conversation? Not how do I prove my point? Simply, what am I missing? You don't even have to ask the question out loud. Just asking silently changes the energy you bring into the conversation. And when your energy changes, the conversation often changes with it. That's the teen talk transition. Not changing your teenager first, changing the way you enter the conversation. And that small shift has the power to change every conversation that follows. Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with something that I believe every parent needs to hear. Your teenager is changing, and we already know that, right? They're becoming more independent, they're spending more time with friends, they're developing opinions that don't always match yours. Sometimes it feels like they're pulling away. And if you're anything like most parents I work with, that can be heartbreaking because it doesn't just feel like you're losing conversation. It feels like you're losing your child. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if your teenager isn't trying to create distance? They're trying to discover who they are. Think back to when you were a teenager. You probably questioned your parents. You probably wanted more independence. You probably wanted to make some decisions on your own. That wasn't because you stopped loving your parents, it was because you were becoming your own person. Your teenager is doing the same thing. The challenge is that while they're learning who they are, we're learning who we have to become as parents. And that's not always easy because the parenting style that worked when they were 8 won't always work when they're 16. Not because you're failing, but because the relationship is evolving. And every healthy relationship has to evolve. I think one of the biggest mindset shifts we can make is this. Our goal isn't to win conversation. Our goal is to keep the conversation going. Those two things are very different. When we focus on winning, someone usually loses. But when we focus on protecting the relationship, everyone has room to grow. That doesn't mean we ignore disrespect. It doesn't mean we stop setting boundaries. It doesn't mean we become our teenager's best friend. It means we recognize the correction that has the greatest impact inside of the relationship that already feels emotionally safe. Because teenagers are far more likely to receive guidance when they know our first priority is understanding them, not defeating them. So, today, here is what I hope you'll remember. If every conversation with your teenager seems to end in an argument, don't start by asking, how do I stop the arguments? Instead, ask, what is the argument trying to teach me about our communication? Because arguments are often the symptom, not the disease. They're invitations. Invitations to slow down, to become curious, to notice what's happening beneath the words. To remember that every conversation is teaching your teenager something, not just the topic you're discussing, but about whether your relationship feels emotionally safe. That's the teen talk transition. It's the moment you stop trying to control the conversation and start trying to understand the person. And that single transition has the power to change not only today's conversation, but every conversation that follows. I want to leave you with today's principle. The quality of your conversation determines the quality of your relationship. Not because every conversation has to be perfect, but because every conversation teaches your teenager one important lesson. Is it safe to come to my parent? Every interaction answers that question long before your teenager ever says it out loud. So, before your next conversation with your teenager, I want you to pause for just a moment. Instead of thinking about what you're going to say, think about what kind of experience you want them to have. Do you want them to feel corrected or connected? Do you want them to remember your advice or your presence? Because years from now, your teenager won't remember every conversation you had, but they'll remember how those conversations made them feel. And that's exactly why this work matters. If today's conversation helped you see your relationship with your teenager a little differently, I'd love for you to let me know in the comments. Have you ever realized an argument wasn't really about what you were arguing about? I love to hear your experience because chances are another parent reading your comment needs to know that they're not alone. And if you're ready to build stronger conversations and deeper trust with your teenager, Make sure you subscribe because this is only the beginning. If you're looking for more guidance, I also recommend my book, Bridging the Teen Gap. It's filled with practical tools and conversation strategies to help you strengthen your relationship with your teenager, one interaction at a time. Remember, you don't have to become the perfect parent. You just have to become a parent your teenager feels safe coming back to. I'll see you guys in the next video.